that Cosmos, as we knew him at Becker House before he got his doctorate, was a truly dynamic member of the community who organized sessions a lot like this every Wednesday night that exposed undergraduate students to a wide variety of viewpoints and intense discussions. In particular, I think opening a lot of the US-based students to a wider view of the world and some of the conflicts, in particular in places like Rwanda, for instance. I remember a very truly dynamic session that he was able to organize on the sort of aftermath of the genocide of Rwanda that really affected a lot of students and pushed them to think more deeply. So I'm really, it was impossible to say no to his invitation. I was under far too many obligations to him already to even think of that. So I'm really glad to be here and grateful to you all for showing up. So I want to talk just a minute about what's really two halves of the same project. Certainly it's about the same sorts of questions, and these questions address, as you just heard, the long-term ramifications of racialized policing in the United States, its roots, its development, its consequences throughout American history, but also resistance to those processes and the ways in which that resistance has its own political arc, has developed its own narrative, if you will, which in many ways becomes one of the most significant processes of history that we can find in the United States, because the kinds of political, cultural, and social solidarities that have been built up over time as a means of resisting, in the widest sense of the term resisting, the racialized policing of people of African descent in the United States, in many ways is at the root of the best things that the United States can offer to the world. I think some of the most significant concepts of human freedom, of human solidarity and political organization come out of that process. If we see that process in a large enough, as a picture in a large enough frame. So I'm trying to write a book on the long history of racialized policing in the United States. And so far, I've just sort of roughed out the first half, which leads up into emancipation in the United States. So into the late 1860s. And of course, many people are very familiar with this history, or increasingly familiar with its history over the last, and how it's moved over the last 40, 50 years. The inquiry into the phenomenon of racialized policing. And again, if we write the phenomenon, we see it in large enough framework, we see that also includes the rise of mass incarceration in the society and all the sort of political dynamics associated with that and with policing. We're familiar with that history over the last 40 and 50 years, increasingly, at any rate we are. But the sort of deep roots of this, sometimes we tend to assume, right? Because after all, it is quite a lot of work simply to grapple with the implications of this phenomenon in the present day. And so we see people saying things like the slave patrols are the roots of American policing, and certainly they're part of that story. But what I would argue, and this is the first message I would bring to you today, and this may not be news, but I would argue that in fact that only begins to capture how deeply embedded the policing, in particular of unauthorized movement by African Americans and people of African descent, that policing, that process of policing, was understood by the end of the 1600s by European and European descended settler colonists who were increasingly defining themselves as white over and against people they were also defining as Black. Well, they were defining themselves to a large extent through the process of policing, figuring out how to do it, who was obligated to do it, what powers they had to police. And this becomes from the perspective of white colonists, a society-wide obligation that precedes the creation of formalized slave patrols. They become part of that process. Some of the first laws that are passed in the colonies that recognize and delimit slavery as an institution. And they don't invent slavery as an institution. They don't invent racialized enslavement of Africans in the Atlantic world as an institution. That was already well underway by 1492. This is an institution that they adopt and adapt as part of that larger process of European colonization of the New World. But the particular forms that it takes in the United States ultimately are to no small extent shaped by the laws, which again are some of the first ones to recognize and delimit slavery as an institution, recognize and create borders of race. These are laws and legal processes that have to do with policing, in particular with the apprehension and the coercion, the surveillance of people who are suspected to be runaways from slavery, right? And so early on, we see that runaways of African descent who are captured in an environment where the majority of bound laborers in Virginia in the 1630s and 40s were indentured servants from Europe. In that environment, those who run away who are Black are given much harsher punishments, specifically with the intention of finding ways to coerce those and intimidate those who are bound for life rather than for a term of years. By the 1660s and 1670s, white colonists are given the authority to kill runaways who resist, and increasingly, and this is different colony by colony, but certainly this is the case in multiple colonies, whites are identified as inhabitants of the colony, signaling that they have a kind of citizenship, a kind of belonging, and Blacks are identified as Negroes, or Black, marked as in certain ways as other. And those who are demarcated as inhabitants are in many cases given not only the power, but the duty to stop, to identify, so to surveil, right, and to capture, to police, in short, those Africans who might be runaways. So, if we stop and think for a minute, we can see that the connection between citizenship and belonging in society on the one hand, and the policing of Black people in society on the other hand, is already being made fairly concrete. And that is, in addition, being mixed together with the creation of what is in some ways a new identity, the identity of whiteness, as opposed to being English, being Scottish, being Irish, being a servant, being a yeoman, or being free, or something like that. Those identities continue to have their force, but a collective set of identities that is bordered, right, that is enclosed within both the capacity and the duty to police the movement of Black people is, we could argue, being created by the early 1700s in the North American colonies. And one other thing I think that is crucial to understand about this is that while the processes in some ways and the laws in some other cases have significant overlap, if you look at British Caribbean colonies, if you look at Spanish Caribbean colonies, if you look at processes in Brazil, and so on and so forth, there are many similarities. There's borrowing from here of concepts and institutions and so on. But there are also some distinctive things about the North American colonies, particularly those that have relatively large Black populations. Because as large as those populations were, they were never as large proportionately as they were in the British Caribbean colonies. So by the mid 1700s Jamaica, 90% of the population is enslaved. 90% of the population is Black, mostly first generation Africans who are survivors of the Middle Passage. In North America, the situation is more complex because in every colony, except for South Carolina, and almost in South Carolina, whites are a majority. And so the process of policing becomes functionally, and sometimes we could argue intentionally, becomes a kind of social cement that papers over divisions among whites, which could become political ones. They become united in the common processes of settler colonialism, because we could also say the struggle against indigenous people also serves some of the same function. And of course, indigenous people have been eliminated from many of the Caribbean islands by the time you get into the late 1700s, not all, but some. And so while certainly uniting against the Black population was a necessity for whites in Jamaica, for instance, as they saw it, right? It becomes a political necessity to keep that front and center on the agenda of whites, self-identified whites in a place like Virginia, where 40% of the colony is Black by the 1750s and 1760s. And 60% is white, and they don't necessarily agree with each other. So getting people who are white focused on identifying and suppressing a common perceived enemy in their midst, and seeing that as the core thing that bonds them together becomes in certain ways not necessarily more important than in the British Caribbean, but important in a different way. So I'm working on this project of writing a history of that process, and then its continuation through the Revolution, through the early days of U.S. nationalism, and on all the way to the present. But there's one other project that goes alongside it, which is more of a collective project, which is building a database of so-called runaway slave ads, and this is called Freedom on the Move. And I think Cosmas alluded to it a little bit back in his introduction. And without taxing your patience right now, what I want to say is that this database, which I'm building with several other scholars, and in fact a much larger group of people because elements of the database are crowdsourced, is something we could certainly look at as part of the discussion. There are about 28,000 ads in there right now. Behind that database, there's another database that I'm using for my research, but we haven't been able to put all the ads up there yet. We've got 40,000 different individuals whose information is recorded in that database. And this is just in many ways scratching the surface. Runaway ads were posted when, for instance, Harriet Tubman, who was known at that time as Araminta or Minty, runs away from her Maryland enslaver in the 1840s. They are posted in newspapers once newspapers emerge in the colonies in the early part of the 18th century. They're posted, these advertisements are printed all the way up until February 1865, just 6 or 7 weeks before Richmond falls. They're still being published in Richmond. And they become a crucial part of the policing apparatus and a sort of engine for the further development of the society-wide policing of Black movement. Even when northern states start their own processes of emancipation, African Americans who escape and make it to the North are not necessarily comfortable, free, not just because of the endemic racism and policing that happens in those specific contexts, but because they were never immune from the threat of recapture from Southern enslavers. In fact, the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution, I think it's Article 4, Section 2, is one of the sort of glue pieces of the Constitution that bonds together the North and the South. So the fugitive slave ads have a function of policing, but they also reveal information about people's resistance and information about human beings who are doing one of the most human things that we can possibly identify, which is trying to make decisions and enact those decisions about their own lives, to seek freedom, to seek some kind of liberty. And so slave owners who post those ads often say more about those enslaved people than they ever say in any other source. And they do so because those individuals refused for at least that period of time to be governed. And in order to sort of motivate other whites to collect them into, if you will, a kind of virtual posse to hunt them, the enslavers try to put as much information into those ads as possible. We can read those ads with a grain to tell us things about how policing worked, particularly by the time we get into the 1800s, how Black people were surveilled in this country. And we can also read them against the grain to give us clues about strategies of resistance and things like that. So we may find it useful in the discussion to take a look at this. I don't know, but the database is at freedomonthemove.org. Cosmos, I didn't ask you to give me the ability to share screen, but if people are interested, we could do that at some point. But anyway, I know I was just supposed to introduce the topic. I hope I've done it to some extent, and I'll stop talking there. I think you're muted.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent introduction to the conversation we intend to have. There couldn't have been a better preface, and there couldn't have been a better singer of that poem. Perhaps I should ask, what was it that inspired you to take this part of research, looking at fugitive laws, regulations, and how it all connects with policing in America? What were the inspirations, and what might have been the challenges you've seen so far?
Yeah, I think, we historians, we want to talk about the past on its own terms, and that I think is something that we strive to do. But at the same time, if we're honest, we also say the questions we ask are driven by our own times and the conflicts and struggles that we find ourselves the heirs to, and perhaps even in some cases participants in. And so I had always wanted to help to create a database of the fugitive slave ads, primarily because of what they said about self-liberating people as individuals, right? The details that we could glean about people as people from them. But the events beginning with the killing of Trayvon Martin, I think, have shaped American political discourse, resistance to dominant systems of policing in new ways, ways that I think are inescapable certainly for me to think about as I do this work. And so the things that have happened since 2012, not just publicized incidents, but I think much more importantly, the emergence of a powerful police abolition movement that has united with the prison abolition movement in certain ways, forcing new questions onto the agenda of American public life, and creating the single biggest protest movement in US history. It just simply wouldn't be true if I said, well, I'm asking questions that I always thought of every day. I'm hearing new questions asked, and so those are becoming, I think, part of the collection of questions that I'm trying to ask the sources.
Thank you for the answer. And this is a moment where we welcome participation by members of the audience. The initial question was to kind of lay the foundations for your participation. So feel free to indicate or put in questions in the chat box, and we will be happy to take your questions. Tiffany, do you have a question at this time?
Hi. I guess one thing that I'm interested in is there's some prior work that you've done around capitalism and slavery, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that ties into race and policing, not only in the historical context that you mentioned, with people thinking of slaves as property, looking to protect that, but how that same thread then continues to what we're seeing now with general, more broad scale police brutality.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a 47-part answer to that, but I think reference to a couple of, I think, really significant thinkers maybe helps to frame that a little bit. Although there's so much more to say, but certainly thinking when we think about resistance to slavery now, we can't talk about that in the U.S. context, certainly without talking about the work of Stephanie Camp, a great scholar who passed away far too young, but who wrote about women's resistance to slavery in the pre-Civil War South. And so she really focused on the spatial dimensions of this resistance, on women breaking the boundaries of the plantation, escaping from surveillance, creating spaces, if you will, however ephemeral, for them to exist outside of a ever-present, but not always effective, not always fully effective system of policing their bodies, their movements, their speech, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, one of the things that she's arguing is that this policing is an absolutely essential force for enslavers to engage if they're going to actually keep people enslaved, right? So again, if we look at the comparison to the Caribbean, even on smaller islands, enslaved people were often able to escape into the hills, into the mountains, and create maroon societies and things like that, particularly on some of the larger islands. In the U.S. South, we did have far more maroons than typically has been highlighted by histories, but the problem for slave owners was in some ways even more significant because they were attempting to impose their rule across an entire subcontinent, and a subcontinent with a continually westward moving frontier of conquest of indigenous peoples that had all kinds of porosities. And so this process of continually re-enslaving people through a process, through surveillance and policing, right, is tremendously significant for understanding slave owners' political behavior, their social behavior, their attempts to enlist non-planter whites and northern allies in their own struggles. Their challenge was significant, right? And that's a line of thinking that I think Camp's work takes us into. And that helps to explain things like, helps to answer questions like, why were Southern slave owners so aggressive and assertive in pursuing their political goals? Why were they convinced that in a essentially racist republic that they had to continually push their agenda in order to maintain slavery? The answer is because it was actually quite difficult for them to maintain spatial control and the sort of policing that they needed in order to keep people coerced into slavery. So when we think about slavery as an economic system, we can't think of it outside of its, at the same time, we can't think of it outside of its political context and the kinds of political alliances that were necessary in order to make the economics of it work, right? And those political alliances are in turn have to be maintained, have to be enforced cooperation among whites has to be built and maintained, and in some cases coerced, in order for slave owners to maintain the kind of police power they need to maintain over enslaved people, so that they can continue to extract value from them. And I don't mean to say that this is purely that everything that happens in politics and in social in the social history of the pre-Civil War United States is driven by the economics. These things are dynamically related to each other. More recently, I think one of our greatest living theorists is, if not the greatest, in explaining some of the real some of the formations of political economy in the United States today is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, right, who's a Marxist geographer, and she's the author of the book The Golden Gulag, which is about the development of California's prison system. And one of her key arguments, and she's very much articulated here with Angela Davis in certain ways, but one of her key arguments is that the prison system that you see emerging in California and more broadly in the United States in the 1960s and 70s is a means of maintaining political power and political economic stability in a context where increasingly the demand for industrial labor and industrial laborers specifically is declining, right, in the U.S. And at the same time, political resistance is increasing. And so the creation of a large-scale prison system becomes an effective way to deal with some of those problems, an effective way that becomes even more effective when you look at the political value of both prison systems and policing for maintaining political alliances among whites in the United States today.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat box. Joe, I will come to you immediately after this. 1 second. So there is, thank you. There is a question in the chat box. It's trying to ask, what was policing like prior to the slavery time? That is to say, what was policing like in the colonial times? If that sounds meaningful, if that sounds broad enough. So it's trying to understand, was policing sort of like something that people did amongst themselves, something individuals did for themselves within the federal government, or was there an properly organized militia which served as police units within the country at the time?
So is the question about colonial North America prior to the emergence of large-scale slavery?
Yes.
Okay. So, I mean, we have to recognize that the colonies are, to no small extent, militarized from the beginning in different ways in different places. It's different in New England as opposed to in Virginia. But there is in virtually all of them an institution of the militia from very early on, which is both for dealing with indigenous warfare against indigenous people, or other colonial powers perhaps will come and raid. The Spanish and the French, of course, are the main enemies. But in the southern colonies from the beginning, the militia is also conceived of as an institution for intimidating enslaved people and suppressing any particular more organized counter-resistance, i.e. a slave revolt. So from its inception, there is an institution of the militia, which is a military organization. It has a kind of policing role as well. But in terms of policing, whites policing other whites, so European colonists policing other European colonists, to a large extent, these processes do not happen as processes that we would understand today as policing in other words, a sort of an ever-present institution, an ever-present presence of certainly not professional police, but people who are there to prevent crime from happening, right? Crime was dealt with after it happened, and it was dealt with through a series of community institutions, or at least was supposed to be dealt with in that way. You know, obviously through the legal system, in other cases through sort of posse comitatus, collective attempt to apprehend someone who had committed a crime. So crime is not something that has to be continually suppressed through a process of governing people who are thought of as inherently criminal, whose unauthorized or unsurveilled movement is problematic, right? It is something policing, if there is any policing, is something that largely happens after the fact through the legal system.
Thank you. Joe, you have the floor.
Oh, thanks. Ed, thank you for this. I'm really looking forward to your book. I'm sure you're looking forward to finishing it, but I'm really looking forward to when I can have it in my hands. So I want to just sort of get some clarity on this. You said something I thought was fascinating. So the whole body of whiteness literature captures the idea of the creation of the identity of whiteness is in opposition to this constructed identity of blackness. Who am I? I am he who is not black. I hear you saying something different. You're saying the whole construction of whiteness in a colonial period is tied to who am I? I am he who polices blacks, which is profound and really striking. And so I'm wondering, A, if that's what you mean, and B, since you're carrying this into the present, do you see this same sort of identity construction through policing continuing, or does it take a different form? Or what is your position about identity construction over time vis-a-vis the relationship to policing? Is that clear? Is that
Yeah. And let me take the first one on first. So, my position on the literature on the creation of whiteness, which I think is much bigger in certain ways than what we've recognized. And I would see Edmund Morgan as talking about this. He wrote American Slavery, American Freedom, and his, question is essentially Samuel Johnson's question. How are all these drivers of slaves the ones who are yelling about freedom from oppression, right? But he looks at the crucible of colonial Virginia to try to figure this out, and others like Theodore Allen, who are much more explicitly about this creation of this idea of whiteness, have done so as well, and they've, I think, in the most basic terms, made the argument that you're suggesting, right? That's defined over and against blackness, and I would say also that they argue that the difference is marked out in a variety of ways, which include things like the sort of genetic or parentage definition that they come to, which I don't think they really come. They don't invent it, right? It's already in use in the Iberian Atlantic, which is to say that the womb, the enslaved womb, makes the child enslaved, right? So any child of an enslaved African woman in the New World, certainly in colonial Virginia, is very quickly held to be enslaved, right? And so making that set of claims is part of, and those distinctions is part of what, for the whiteness scholars, helps to create whiteness. And I don't think they're wrong, right? I think that what I'm talking about is an addition to, or another piece of the puzzle, which is to say that this active process of identifying people, and not just a set of professional slave patrollers or cops or constables or whatever, but the entire population of non-African, non-Indigenous people as the ones who are responsible, right, for control, for surveilling and policing the movement of African people is something that's operating on lots of different levels to help to create and to reinforce difference, right, and to identify, to create this sense of identity, which is also which isn't just what we would think of as racial identity. It's political identity, it's social identity, it's cultural identity. Okay, but I think we don't necessarily grapple with right away with some of the implications of it. I mean, here's a law that says you can kill people, right? This is really powerful, right? You can kill them, and there's no way to make a case against you in court, right? Because you can simply say, and this is where it gets, of course, very resonant of the present day, you can simply say, they were resisting, I was threatened, et cetera, et cetera. And in some of those laws, in one of them, 1668 Virginia law, they explicitly argue that enslaved Africans, first of all, sometimes there's no other way to subdue them because they don't have a term of service. They're enslaved for life. So sometimes you just have to kill people who are in that situation. And there's this sort of ambiguous clause, nor can the obstinacy of many of them by other than violent means be suppressed, right? And so there we see very early on the idea that there's something fundamentally different, right? And this might include this inexplicable obstinance, right? This resistance to being policed, which almost necessitates killing them, right? According to the implications of the law. Now, whether I'm reading, 2020 too much into that or not, I think we could, maybe we could debate. I don't know, but it very clearly grants the power to be judge, jury, and executioner to those who are policing enslaved African people. And this is really profound. I mean, that's a power that really was allocated to the king and those to whom he delegated his authority in 16th, 17th, 18th century Europe, right? And here it's being given to every white person in the colony, right? That's a pretty significant way to create a new identity, whether that was the intention or not. Maybe it doesn't even matter so much.
Thank you. And I have Michael Hendricks. Michael, you want to go?
Yes, thank you. So I had the opportunity to look at the Freedom on the Move website, and I noticed many of the ads, or a few of them at least, had bounties up to $50, $100, and that seems like an exorbitant amount of money for that time period, so 1850s, 1840s. Does that indicate that they were willing to offer a higher bounty because there was a minimum risk of the people actually collecting the bounty, which implies that there's a high likelihood that the fugitive would escape? Or does that mean that they were more interested, like they really wanted the fugitive to be collected and sent back as a punitive measure to ensure that no other slaves were escape? Like, to use that slave as an example about what the slave owner would do to catch slaves. Or is there another reason that the bounties are so high?
I think all of the reasons you suggest could apply sometimes at the same time. Typically, rewards are a little lower, but still quite significant in the dollar value of the time. In the period between, let's say, 1830 and 1860, the price of a young adult enslaved person and New Orleans, which is sort of the most active slave trading market, changes, right? It fluctuates with things like the price of cotton. But at different points in that period, a 19 or 20-year-old young man might, if healthy, sell between $1,000 and $2,000, which we can calculate in various ways to get a sense of what that means in today's times, in today's dollar value. But in terms of how that relates to the average wage of the average white adult working class male, you can figure that value out to between 200,000 and 300,000 in 2020 equivalent. So $100 would be 10% or thereabouts of that price, and it's pretty significant, right? You're absolutely right. It's significant. And I think all the reasons you're suggesting might apply. It might be that the enslaver thought that this particular person was particularly valuable, that there might be some reason why they might need to offer a particularly high reward to try to get more attention. You know, maybe they thought this person had run away particularly far or something like that. Or sometimes you could read that and you say, there's something else going on here, right? There's some reason, there really seems to be some way in which, yes, what we might identify as purely economic concerns are definitely part of it, but there's also some sort of emotion-laden contest for power, right? For dominance that's going on here. And I've read a few letters like that. And also there's some ads like that in some cases, there's a famous one from Andrew Jackson that offers a higher value for the enslaved person's head than for their live self, right? So there's clearly a struggle that might have the dimensions that you were mentioning there. You know, it becomes a kind of example to the others.
Excellent. I guess we are doing so well. And Jackie Saya, are you available to ask your question now?
Oh, okay. I guess I can. Hi. So my question was about the 13th Amendment, and I was wondering, since that ties in slavery and crime and the capitalist system, I was wondering. I mean, I don't know a lot about American laws, but can the 13th Amendment be, can it be changed? Can it be amended? Is there something that can be done since it brings in indentured slavery, you know, as a punishment for crime? I guess, and then I guess my other question I had was just about the role of the churches. I mean, I'm from Liberia, and I know that a lot of the churches sent slaves to Liberia, and I was just wondering about their role in slavery in general, and in and how they worked with the powers that be to capture slaves. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, you know, the 13th Amendment, that particular clause that permits forced labor, becomes a kind of point for organizers to dramatize and make a historically resonant link into present day between slavery and the carceral state, mass incarceration, whatever we want to say. And those terms, they can mean slightly different things, but I'm using them as synonyms. But the original intent, a freighted term, right, of the framers of the amendment was essentially to make sure that prisoners in the northern penitentiary system, who were, you know, free people, except that they've been convicted of crimes, that they couldn't demand release, essentially. That's a sort of exception that's carved out that allows for the existence of a penitentiary system. And I almost think that suggesting, as you know, Ava DuVernay's documentary, some say, suggests that I think it's quite an interesting documentary and has a lot of value, but some criticize it on the grounds that it suggests that it's the 13th Amendment that makes possible mass incarceration in the United States. And I would say, I would agree with the critics who say that's not what makes mass incarceration possible in the United States. There are actually forces that are much more powerful than a clause in the 13th Amendment that have built it. In terms of the churches, I mean, I don't know that the sort of mainline Protestant churches that developed in the United States after the Revolution in particular, I don't know that they played a particularly active role in enforcing or supporting the recapture of people who are trying to liberate themselves. But they certainly don't play an active role in opposing the recapture, right? And that's true to a great extent of the northern branches of churches like the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Episcopalians and the Baptists. The Northern Baptists break away from the Southern Baptists earlier than the Presbyterians. The Methodists never quite separate. The Episcopalians never separate. And the Baptists do separate over the issue of slavery. And the Northern white Baptists cannot, they say they cannot countenance being in communion with slaveholders. But I think, obviously what's much more significant is to understand the development of the African-American church as a institution that to a great extent is fugitive, right? It develops under wartime conditions, right? Conditions of surveillance and having to hide, sometimes in plain sight, right? And it also helps to cement the kinds of solidarity and mutual recognition that make possible the creation of an African-American identity out of hundreds or thousands of African identities. And so its creation is both cause and consequence of these processes of solidarity that to a large extent are developed around resistance. So it's trying to figure out how to, write about that in my book in a way that it doesn't become the entire book, right? Because there's so many things to talk about is challenging, right? Because it's so crucial to these processes that sustain resistance.
Thank you.
Thank you. Tiffany, you have a question? Maybe Adrian Scott can ask her question while we wait for Tiffany. Adrian, you want to ask your question? Please unmute yourself, yeah.
Sorry about that. Hi, I was just wondering, since you were talking about the 13th Amendment, if you could go into a bit more detail as to what you see as the more dominant forces that make mass incarceration in the US possible, alternatively to the 13th.
I mean, that's a great question, and I'm just sort of trying to grapple with it. I think that we've got a lot of scholars who are working on this topic and have been working on this topic, and what I learned from them, from people in the early, chronologically, the early phases of it. So people like Khalil Muhammad writing about the criminalization the idea that there's a kind of scientific basis to inherent criminality. So he identifies the history of that idea and how Western social science really incorporates that idea very, very deeply, and how that becomes part of the justification and in its own way an intellectual engine for the rise of incarceration over time. All the way to people like Heather Thompson, who writes about the sort of political value of incarceration to not just the Republican Party, but in New York State. And Julie Kohler-Hausman, my colleague in the history department here, works on this as well. The ways in which incarceration becomes a political answer to all kinds of social and economic questions and challenges that the United States starts to face as it enters a process of deindustrialization, a closing of opportunities for working class whites as well as working class blacks after the mid 1960s. And so those historical forces, combined with the fact that racialization in this country, so the very development of racial identity on the part of whites, some of the sort of founding narratives of it incorporate the idea of the sort of inherent criminality of African Americans and the supposed need to police them, right? So the conjuncture of those forces that really become visible in the 1960s with the deep long-range tendencies of racialization and policing in U.S. history combine in some really devastating ways for the future of the United States starting in the 1960s. And I think the 13th Amendment, if we rewrote it wouldn't really, it probably would not change the outcome of those forces. So I don't know. I haven't written the part about the 60s and 70s and 80s yet. So I may think totally different in a year or two when hopefully I'll be tackling that.
Thank you. Mark, you have the floor, please.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Cosmos, and thank you, Professor Baptiste, for this lecture. I'm in the SEPA program with Tiffany and some of the other attendees. You mentioned a phrase that caught my ear was social cement, that in the early colonial era, which my understanding is that was just a brutal time for everybody, the Europeans created this new caste system, to borrow the title of Isabel Wilkerson's book. And it feels like, over 150 years after the Civil War, we are just stuck in this social cement. And that's really what we're up against, is like an understanding on the part of American whites that their position in the caste system depends on them sort of enforcing this calibration of their ranking. And I just wonder if that would be your interpretation of like, what are we really fighting against now? Like we see like violent opposition to change, even now 160 odd years since the Civil War. Like, is it this social cement, just this like understanding of where we fit in the caste system is why people are fighting back so hard against it?
Yeah, that is a very significant question for not just the next 13 days, but for the long-term future of the United States. As a Census Bureau news that whites self-identified would become a minority in the United States between 2040 and 2050, as that started to kind of percolate into popular understanding between, I'd say, about 2005 and 2015. I think we certainly saw an increase, and I don't think it's coincidental, in xenophobia, nativism, and then we saw the mobilization of those energies in new ways, explicitly by the Republican Party in the United States. But I don't think we can just blame it on a political party per se. You know, I think we have to look more broadly as well. And so I think anxiety about the inability to exert domination, not just over electoral politics, but over the goods that electoral politics can dispense and manage, and the goods that social power more broadly can dispense and manage, started to become much more of a kind of top line issue of social debate. It was there already. And so, as to how do you fix it, how do you deal with it, I mean, it certainly would be easier if whites were not a majority in the US, if that was already accomplished, or, more broadly, if coherent and committed political formations, based upon a kind of solidarity that I think inevitably traces some of its genealogy back to Black abolitionism, if we go far enough. That's a more immediate answer, right? And so, Black Lives Matter as an idea, right? It's not, it's self-consciously not a unitary movement, obviously, but as an idea, it is very much in that particular line, and has the kind of openness that those movements have always had. And so that's very significant. What we saw in June, around the United States was profoundly significant, right? But it was several weeks, right? In some communities, it was longer than several weeks. In every community where you saw it, the roots of it go back far more than several weeks. But it wasn't the end of a process. It didn't finish accomplish. It accomplished much, but it didn't finish accomplishing.
Right.
Thank you. And we will take Tiffany now.
Hi, Professor Baptist. I had a question sort of drawing back to Professor Margulis's question on the creation of a white identity. And I was wondering how you saw this phenomenon of policing, and almost this concept that Professor Margulis brought up of, I am he who polices Black people. I thought that was a really interesting way to, to see some of the comments you were making. I was wondering how does that apply to immigrant populations who may not have originally been considered white, but were later assumed into the larger white population? And how does their interaction with policing impact that? I don't know if that made them count.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And any answer that I give is particularly to that is really partial. I think there's a lot more to figure out there. But I would say this. First of all, the kind of social science narrative that comes out of the understanding, the sort of modernist or modernity's understanding of its own coming into being in Western Europe. The story about policing is that the state, the modern state emerges, and one of the ways in which it emerges is that it claims the power through law and through other juridical processes and through the creation of professional police to be the one source of power, the one social center that has the ability to decide who lives and who dies, right? And that the power to decide who lives and dies is like taken back from local communities. It's stripped from nobles and, you know, other sort of more localistic sources of power, and it's put into the state. And that's part of what actually brings the modern state as we understand it into being. And in the US, I mean, I'm sure that narrative is in some ways fictional for Western Europe, right? But it's an interesting narrative for thinking about the rise of modernity. For the US, it just totally doesn't work that way because of slavery, because of the way race works in the US, and because of the way whiteness works in the US. And so not only do we have this incredibly high murder rate in the US, particularly in the southern states, right, which we also see in a lot of other settler colonial societies to this day, but we also have a disrespect for law that doesn't work in the way that the identity, I am he who polices, I am white and therefore I police and I have the authority to, you know, to inquire, to surveil, to hold, to arrest, to kill if necessary, right? Where law doesn't sustain that idea, right? Law becomes, in the views of many, illegitimate. Many whites, it becomes illegitimate. So in the wake of Reconstruction, we have 50 years of lynching to sort of reinstitute and literally discipline law in the American South. It's carried out by white Southerners. And more recently, in popularly based movements, and I think this is another piece of the story of mass incarceration, popularly based movements for increasing, among whites particularly, for increasing the power of the police and increasing the size and scale of the prison system. Sometimes even if whites get caught up in police violence, right, become the victims of police violence, become caught up in a ever-growing prison system in the 80s and 90s in particular. They become those individuals become collateral damage, right, of the larger project. Now, the challenge, you know, if I mean, Malcolm X made this point a long time ago, and the sort of the scholarship on whiteness really picks it up, which is that becoming anti-Black is one of the tickets into full membership in U.S. society, right? According to Malcolm X, that's the way he saw it. And there's something to that narrative when we look at the arrival of those European populations who were deemed to be less than by the sort of Anglo-American elite. And so they participate in many cases actively in the formation of the first, as members of the first professional police forces in the US, and generation after generation, you see that happening, right? So that's one part of this story, but there are other ways in which they police in the sort of less formalized way. Certainly since post-1965, some of those things come into question, right? The vast majority of immigrants to the US are not white by the historical definitions of the US. And so figuring out how those folks are going to get assimilated into Americanness becomes a new sort of challenge, right? And the process works differently for different groups, right? And different groups come up with different approaches to this process. But it also becomes a challenge for second generation African descended immigrants into the US, right? Because their experience, this is not any great revelation on my part, but their experience of racialized policing in the United States is not inflected by any ideas they had when they were coming to the US, right? It is not shaped by their status as immigrants. It is shaped by many factors, but one of the factors is the way that they are perceived, which is no longer as an immigrant, but as part of the Black population in the United States.
Thank you. And it appears we have a little time for just one or two more questions. Maybe we should take those two questions, then Professor Baptist will attempt to answer them at the same time. Taylor, you want to give us your question real quick, and then Beniam, we will take your question.
Can you hear me okay? My audio is a little bit.
Perfect, perfect.
Hi, everyone. I'm a first-year PhD student in the Africana Studies department, and I'm actually in the midst of writing my first grad school paper on the Fugitive Slave Act and its connection between the deputizing of the change between the law and the state carrying out the power, and then the deputizing of individual whites, particularly non-slave owning whites, to carry out this mission of policing and control, and that being, in my view, like a central tenet of whiteness and the creation of white identity, like to Tiffany's question. And I was just wondering if you could comment on the connection between that and how I see this like Karen effect of white women, calling the police on Black men just like walking down the street. You see instances of even in like liberal neighborhoods, Black people facing violence at the hands of individual whites who are called on by their racial identity to police their property and like to protect white space. I was wondering if you could maybe provide earlier examples of this phenomenon. Maybe like I'm thinking of the woman who called the police on Emmett Till, but earlier, like post-Civil War, during this period. And if you could just comment on a broader connection between the call to whites to, as a tenet of their racial identity, to carry out this policing and vigilantism in their own spaces.
Thank you. Beniam, please, let's have that, your brilliant, important question.
No pressure, huh? Brilliant. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you, Professor Baptiste, for the lecture and for making yourself available. So I was very interested in attending today because, like many here, I think I am interested in trying to understand the meanings and the function of contemporary American policing, of course, which is part of a larger state structure. And I wonder to what extent historical analogies are useful for us and how we can use history in trying to understand the present. And particularly when we think about these identities, which we talk about as social constructions and have a life of their own, in terms of how they came to be and the political practices that are part of that history. Well, when we think of contemporary policing, mass incarceration, the carceral system, it also has an interesting economic and political history or economic and political story. So when you were talking about the larger project, and you were, I think, alluding to, for instance, lynching and the purpose of lynching, it reminded me of Oliver C. Cox, a Caribbean scholar, has a wonderful short 14-page article on lynching and the status quo. And he tries to understand racialized violence, lynching, in the context of the period in which you're looking at, post-1865, after the 13th Amendment, as the tool, the strategy of the Southern white elites' class rule, the attempt to recreate a particular type of political, economic, and social order. And so the masses of poor whites also participated in that process. So when we think about contemporary policing, let's say post-1970s, starting from Nixon as an example with the war on drugs, the carceral system, as well as the system of policing, has a political and an economic story, objective, function, in which, for instance, the policies are actually designed, made by either the oligarchs, the term that we're now using today very comfortably in the context of the United States, or the representatives of particularly big capital, right? So a great example could be Joe Biden, in the 1994 crime bill is a great example of that. So I wonder if this idea of the relationship between both race and the ideology of racism, which is a paramount sort of ideology in the United States, and the establishment of a particular type of status quo that history can provide us. The example of lynching after the post-1865 Civil War can be a way of usefully using history to try to understand contemporary United States and the way in which the criminal justice system is functioning.
Yeah, those are two great questions. Each one would require several monographs to fully answer. But what I would say is that one of the challenges as a historian, because we historians like to talk about change over time, sort of an article of faith that things change over time, is one of the challenges is looking at this process and not saying it's the same thing. It's the same thing for 350, maybe even 401 years, and that's a little daunting. And so when we try to explain how history shapes the present and the limits the possibilities for the immediate future, or sets the agenda for change to shape a better long-term future, it is very tempting to reach into the past, right? And say, look, this is the same as this is the same as that, particularly with these kinds of questions. And I think when we do that, we're not entirely wrong, because there is a very tight genealogical set of relationships that stretch, I would argue, back into the 17th century. But as both the questions suggested, there are also things that change over time, right? And new trajectories for both racialized policing and everything that shapes in U.S. society, but also for resistance, for political solidarities and oppositions that emerge. And sometimes those don't ultimately pan out, and the system reverts to something that seems a great deal like the previous trajectory, right? But sometimes they do shape significant change. Emancipation is one of those shifts for sure. And lynching is one of the responses to that. But ultimately, lynching does not, I would say, carry the day. And I think that's important to remember. It creates an immense amount, as a process, creates an immense amount of human suffering, death, and violence. But people organize against it, and they change the world in order to try to stop it in ways that are really significant to us today. Likewise, my easy answer to Taylor's question is, well, these Karens calling 911 on people for walking down the street are not only dangerous, but they're not new. They're just filmed now because everybody's got a camera and a computer and whatever in their pocket, and that that's not a revelation. Everybody knows that this isn't new. It's just getting filmed. But the fact that it's getting filmed is a reality of enormous political significance. The willingness of people to put up encounters for public display and discussion when the intent of that encounter was to humiliate and discipline and threaten them. Each time that happens, that's an act of courage. That's an act with tremendous political significance. That's an act that people who respond to it in forms and in acts and expressions of solidarity are making their own political choices about a choice to pay attention to it rather than ignoring it. And so So it's not the same thing in that sense. And so, I'm wrestling every day with making sure I don't say it's the same damn thing over and over again for 401 years, because the story is much more complicated and rich. And in particular, when we look at resistance and organization, and creativity and solidarity and response to those things, that those acts that people have, that fit into those categories that people have carried out in the past and are carrying out in this day are, they're hugely important. They are in a lot of ways the air that, that we can breathe, and the hope that we can have for a future beyond police violence, beyond racialized policing and all of its many forms.
Thank you, Professor Baptist. And I think that's been quite an amazing set of conversations we've had. We could as well continue, but I must apologize. We have taken a little more of your time than we bargained for. But I mean, it was such a sweet conversation, we forgot. So I will allow Tiffany to make the vote of thanks, and then we will call it a day. But thank you from here. And Tiffany, please.
Thank you, Cosmos. To Professor Baptist, I just want to echo Cosmos's thoughts. We're very excited to have had you here. I think it's been an engaging discussion. We appreciate the time and the attention that you've put into this talk and spending the time with us. And we look forward to potentially working with you again in the future.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I just realized I should I should tell you all that I'm actually teaching a graduate seminar in the history department on this very subject next semester. And I probably should have led with that, but anyway. So if any of you all are interested in continuing the conversations, just get in touch with me and we could try to do that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for everyone for attending. You've made our day. You've made our effort meaningful. Without you, it wouldn't have made any sense. But with you, you have tied together the pieces of the loom, which we have been looking for. And we hope that such dialogues like this will continue to help us unlock the possibilities of our society, which is better human flourishing and more inclusive society. I wish you well and do stay safe at this time.
Thank you.